March 18th, 1964. 8:10 a.m. A 9-year-old girl walks down a street in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Blue jacket, dark hair, 2 cans of fruit in her arms, a gift for her teacher. She has half a mile to walk to school. She never arrives. By 1 p.m. that same day, her body is found 3 miles away at the bottom of a coal mining pit, bound, gagged, strangled. For 58 years, her killer's name remained a secret. He died in 1980. But in 2020, a college freshman refused to let a killer's secret stay buried, determined to finally deliver justice for her and her family. How does an 18-year-old college student solve what professional investigators couldn't crack for 6 decades? This is the story of Marise Ann Chiverella, a cold case that haunted a Pennsylvania coal town for more than half a century. Before we begin, I always love connecting with you guys, so let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true cold case stories. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, sits in the heart of Luzerne County, about 80 miles north of Philadelphia. In 1964, it was a tight-knit community built on coal mining and immigrant families, the kind of place where children walked to school in groups, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where the church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. Marise Ann Chiverella was born on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1954, in Waterloo, New York. Her father, Carmen Chiverella, was from Wilkes-Barre. Her mother, Mary Swatch Chiverella, was a Hazleton native. The couple had moved to New York for work, but eventually returned to Mary's hometown to raise their family. By 1964, the Chiverellas lived on Alter Street in a modest home right next to the family business. Carmen owned and operated a neighborhood grocery store called the Little Market. It was demanding work, picking up supplies early in the morning, keeping the store open from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week, then doing the bookkeeping late into the night. Mary worked at a knitting mill in downtown Hazleton, balancing factory shifts with raising 5 children. Marise was the second youngest. Her older brother Ron was 16, a high school student who helped around the house. Her older sister Carmen Marie was 13. Her brother Barry was 11. And her youngest brother David was 7, still young enough that he and Marise spent hours playing together. Marise had bright blue eyes and dark hair. She was shy by nature, but well-liked at school. Teachers and classmates remember her as gentle and kind, the type of child who cared more about others than herself. She had a deep faith, unusual for someone so young. She'd told people she wanted to become a nun when she grew up. At home, Marise loved playing the organ. Her parents had bought one from Sears, and she would sit at it for hours, practicing hymns and making up her own songs. Sometimes her older brother Ron would sit beside her, and together they'd compose little melodies. It was one of the small rituals that held the family together, despite the long hours their parents worked. On the evening of March 17, 1964, Marise's teacher at St. Joseph's Academy mentioned that the next day, March 19th, was the feast day of St. Joseph. One of the nuns would be celebrating. If any students wanted to bring a small gift, like canned goods, they were welcome to do so. Marise volunteered immediately. That evening, she went to her father's store and picked out 2 cans of fruit. She set them aside. She told her family she wanted to leave early the next morning so she could deliver the gift before classes began. The morning of March 18th was cold. Winter was loosening its grip, but the air still had teeth. Marise bundled up in her blue jacket, wrapped her colorful scarf around her neck, and grabbed her gloves. She picked up the 2 cans of fruit and left home shortly after 8 a.m. It was a normal morning. Everyone got up, got ready for school. Marise left first. Her siblings would follow a few minutes later. Her route was simple and familiar. Down Alter Street, east along West 4th Street, then toward the church and school on North Laurel Street. 5 to 6 blocks. A walk she'd made dozens of times. Ron Chiverella, who was 16 at the time, remembers that morning clearly, even decades later. He and Barry and David left the house a few minutes after Marise. They expected to see her ahead of them on the street. They didn't. At St. Joseph's Academy, when Marise didn't arrive, teachers assumed she was homesick. Her family thought she was at school. The Chiverella children usually came home for lunch. That afternoon, Barry and David came through the door. Marise didn't. That's when Carmen Chiverella, Marise's father, realized something was wrong. He told the boys, "Go back to school and find her." They did. They spoke to Marise's homeroom teacher. The teacher said she hadn't seen Marise either. She'd marked her absent through the morning classes. That's when everyone realized something had gone terribly wrong. Carmen Chiverella began searching the neighborhood. He walked the streets. He knocked on doors. He asked neighbors if they'd seen a small girl in a blue jacket carrying canned goods. Then one of the neighborhood women called out to him. She asked who he was looking for. Carmen told her. And the woman said, "If you're looking for the little girl, they found her." The world stopped. About 3 miles from the Chiverella home, in an area known as the Stripping Pits, abandoned coal mine excavations in Hazleton Township, a man named Arthur Robinson was giving his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson. They were driving along a rural road when they passed an old refuse pit. It was a dumping area, a place where people discarded trash and debris. Arthur happened to glance down the embankment. About 25 feet down the slope, he saw something. At first, he thought it was a doll. A large doll, maybe, discarded like everything else in the pit. He stopped the car, looked closer. It wasn't a doll. Arthur Robinson immediately drove to the nearest phone and called the Pennsylvania State Police. Troopers arrived within minutes. They made their way down the embankment, careful not to disturb the scene. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Marise Ann Chiverella lay at the bottom of the pit. Her hands were bound. Her feet were bound. There were marks around her neck. Her clothing had been disturbed. A scarf, what people back then called a babushka, had been stuffed into her mouth. But her blue jacket wasn't dirty. It wasn't torn. It looked as if she had been carefully placed there, not thrown or discarded. The priests from St. Joseph's Academy arrived soon after. It was common practice in those days for clergy to administer last rites at the scene of a sudden death. One of the priests knew Marise. He identified her. The coroner arrived. An autopsy was performed. The findings were clear. Marise had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. There was a severe bruise on her abdomen, as if someone had struck her with great force, causing internal damage. This was 1964. DNA evidence didn't exist. Investigators looked for blood, for fingerprints, for anything the perpetrator might have left behind. They collected Marise's clothing. They documented the scene. They searched for witnesses. Troopers interviewed Carmen and Mary Chiverella. They interviewed Ron, Carmen Marie, Barry, and David. They established a timeline. Marise had left home shortly after 8 a.m. She'd been seen on West 4th Street around 8:10. By 1 p.m., she was found. 5 hours. That's all it took for a little girl to disappear from the world. Pennsylvania State Police began canvassing the neighborhood. They contacted everyone who lived within a 5-block radius. They asked about Marise's route to school. They asked if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning, a car, a stranger, anything. The investigation consumed the department. Retired Trooper Donald Good was one of the first officers on the scene. Years later, at the age of 89, he would recall those days with vivid clarity. He and his fellow troopers worked 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, without a single day off, until mid-July of 1964. They were determined to find the person who did this. But in a town like Hazleton, everyone was a suspect, and everyone was terrified. Ron Marchetti, who lived in Hazleton and was the same age as Marise, remembers the fear that settled over the community. People wondered if it was one of their neighbors. That was the scariest part, not knowing who it was or what they might do next. The church was packed for Marise's funeral. The lines at the viewing stretched out the doors of the funeral home. Hundreds of people came to say goodbye to a 9-year-old girl they'd never see grow up. A local newspaper ran a headline that would be remembered for decades. "Farewell, kiss from mother as coffin closed." Marise Chiverella bent over her daughter's casket and kissed her goodbye. A mother should never have to bury her child. But there she was, saying farewell to a little girl who'd left for school that morning with 2 cans of fruit and never came home. The biggest question, the one that haunted everyone, was simple. Why? Why would someone do this terrible thing to Marise? By the end of 1964, investigators had followed thousands of leads. They'd interviewed countless suspects. 2 men rose to the top of the list. One eventually took his own life. The other confessed, but when pressed on details, his story didn't match the evidence. He was eliminated. The case went cold. The girl who left for school and never came home became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a wound that wouldn't heal. For 43 years, the murder of Marise Ann Chiverella remained unsolved. Carmen and Marise Chiverella raised their remaining 4 children under the shadow of that loss. Ron graduated high school, then college. Carmen Marie grew up and married, taking the last name Ratka. Barry and David became men who carried the memory of their little sister with them everywhere they went. Every night before dinner, Marise Chiverella would say grace, and every night she would end with the same prayer, that the Pennsylvania State Police would one day solve her daughter's case. The family didn't want revenge. They didn't speak of hatred or punishment. They wanted justice. They wanted to know who had taken Marise from them, and they wanted that person to be held accountable. The Pennsylvania State Police never forgot the case either. Every year, investigators reviewed the files. They re-interviewed witnesses. They looked for new angles. The case file grew thicker with each passing decade. Over 6,000 pages of reports, interviews, photographs, and evidence. But without forensic DNA technology, there was little they could do beyond traditional detective work. Then, in 2007, something changed. With advancements in forensic science, the Pennsylvania State Police decided to take another look at the evidence. They sent Marise's clothing, carefully preserved for over 40 years, to the lab for re-examination. This time, scientists found something they hadn't been able to detect in 1964. On Marise's jacket, they found seminal fluid, biological evidence, the killer's DNA. From that stain, they were able to develop a DNA profile. It was a breakthrough, the kind investigators dream about. After 43 years, they finally had a genetic fingerprint of the person who murdered Marise Ann Chiverella. The DNA profile was immediately uploaded to CODIS, the National Criminal Database. Every month, the lab checked the profile against new entries, arrests, convictions, anyone whose DNA had been collected and logged into the system. But month after month, year after year, there was no match. Either the killer had been dead for a long time, or he'd never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample. The case stalled again. Then, in the fall of 2017, a new investigator took over. His name was Corporal Mark Barron. He inherited the case from Corporal McAndrew, who was retiring after years of working the Chiverella file. Corporal Barron looked at the massive case file, over 6,000 pages, and knew he needed a new approach. He learned about a cutting-edge technology that could take a DNA sample and create a snapshot of what the suspect might look like based on genetic markers, ethnicity, hair color, eye color, facial features. In May of 2018, the DNA sample was sent to a company called Parabon Nanolabs. In October of that year, the results came back. The snapshot suggested a white male with dark hair and a wide nose. Parabon created images showing what he might have looked like at age 25, 40, and 60. In March of 2019, Pennsylvania State Police released those images to the public. They asked for help. Anyone with information was encouraged to come forward. The response was limited, but the images did catch the attention of one particular person, a college freshman who happened to be scrolling through cold case articles on a February night in 2020. Eric Schubert was 18 years old in February of 2020. He was a freshman at Elizabethtown College in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, studying history. But his real passion wasn't in the classroom, it was genealogy. Eric had been fascinated by family trees since he was about 10 years old. What started as a casual hobby during winter breaks became an obsession. He spent hours poring over census records, military documents, birth certificates, newspaper archives. He helped family members trace their lineage. He solved mysteries about adoptions and unknown relatives. He taught himself the science of DNA analysis and how to interpret genetic matches. By his late teens, Eric had developed a reputation. He started assisting law enforcement agencies near Philadelphia and Chicago with cold cases. He used public genealogy databases and DNA evidence to help identify suspects in unsolved crimes. It was a new field, forensic genetic genealogy, and Eric was quickly becoming one of its youngest practitioners. In February of 2020, Eric was reading up on cold cases in Pennsylvania. Hazleton was only about 80 miles from his college campus. When he came across an article about the Marise Chiverella case, something stopped him. A 9-year-old girl, 1964, no arrest, 56 years of silence. He read the details, the blue jacket, the cans of fruit, the coal pit. The family that had waited decades for answers. He couldn't get the article out of his mind. Finally, Eric decided to reach out. He drafted an email to the Pennsylvania State Police. He introduced himself. He explained his background in forensic genealogy. He said he wasn't trying to step on anyone's toes, but if there was any chance he could help with the case, he would love to do it. He hit send, not expecting a response. After all, he was just a college kid. Why would they trust him? But they did. Lieutenant Devin Brutowski, the commander of Troop N Criminal Investigations, decided to vet Eric Schubert. He learned that Eric had indeed helped other departments solve cold cases. He learned that Eric had the skills, the tools, and the dedication to make a difference. Brutowski arranged a meeting. They met at a coffee shop on Eric's college campus. Eric came prepared, as if it were a job interview. He brought his portfolio, his credentials, his track record. Corporal Mark Barron was there too. He explained the situation. The DNA profile had been uploaded to a publicly available genealogical database by Parabon Nanolabs. They had a few distant matches, very distant, possibly sixth cousins, but no clear path forward. Corporal Barron handed Eric the information, and Eric got to work. He started by building family trees. He traced lineages backward through generations, looking for common ancestors. He used census records, birth and death certificates, military service records, marriage licenses. He cross-referenced obituaries and newspaper archives. He mapped out entire family branches. It was painstaking work. The kind of work that required hours every single week, week after week, month after month. Eric juggled his college coursework, his part-time jobs, and his social life, all while spending countless hours in front of his computer chasing leads on a 56-year-old murder case. He made a calculated genealogical decision. Rather than chasing every lead equally, he focused on one side of the family tree that seemed particularly promising. As he dug deeper, he found something interesting. A large family with Italian lineage. The surname was Palmeno. Eric thought, okay, we have this family, we have all these people. Now it's time to get some DNA samples and see if we're on the right track. For more than a year, Eric and the investigators collected data, narrowed their search, and followed the branches of the Palmeno family tree. And then they got a break. Some publicly uploaded DNA samples in a few specific families matched the profile. The list narrowed. 2,000 names became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became a handful. Eventually, they had it narrowed down to 2 people, 2 brothers. One brother had died several years earlier. The other had died back in 1980. Corporal Barron and his team dug into the backgrounds of both men. One of them had an extensive criminal history. In 1974, he'd been arrested for sexual assault. The details were strikingly similar to what had happened to Marise in 1964. His name was James Paul Fort. The investigators were 99% sure, but there was a problem. James Paul Fort had been dead for over 40 years, and he didn't have any children. There was no easy way to get a direct DNA sample. There was only one option left. In late 2021, Corporal Mark Barron and his team met with the district attorney's office. They presented their findings: the genealogical work, the criminal history, the timeline, the similarities between the 1974 sexual assault and the 1964 murder. Everything pointed to James Paul Fort. But they needed proof. They needed a direct DNA match, not just a genealogical link. The district attorney agreed. They obtained a search warrant to exhume James Paul Fort's body. In January of 2022, the exhumation was carried out quietly, without public announcement. Forensic technicians extracted tissue samples from the remains and sent them to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab. On February 3, 2022, nearly 58 years after Marise Ann Chiverella was murdered, the results came back. The DNA from James Paul Fort's remains matched the DNA from the semen stain found on Marise's jacket. It was a perfect match. Corporal Mark Barron would later describe the statistical significance in stark terms. He said that to put the numbers in perspective, there have only been an estimated 117 billion people who have ever lived on Earth. To find another person with DNA that matched James Paul Fort's profile, you would need to search over 4 million planet Earths. In other words, the match was absolute. After 57 years, 11 months, and 26 days, the Pennsylvania State Police knew the name of Marise Ann Chiverella's killer, James Paul Fort, a 22-year-old bartender who lived 6 or 7 blocks from where Marise was last seen on March 18, 1964. A man with no known connection to the Chiverella family. A man who had died in 1980, 42 years before his identity as the killer was confirmed. On the morning of February 10, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference at the Hazleton Township Commons. The room was crowded with reporters, law enforcement officials, and members of the Chiverella family. Lieutenant Devin Brutowski stood at the podium and delivered the news. James Paul Fort had kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 9-year-old Marise Ann Chiverella. He had lived just 6 blocks away from her. And he had died in 1980, never facing justice for what he did. Corporal Mark Barron spoke next. His voice wavered. His eyes filled with tears. He said it was one of the most significant days of his life. He said the case had been talked about across generations of families in the Hazleton area. He said that what happened to Marise had changed the community forever. Whether you liked it or not, he said, the way you lived changed after March 18, 1964. Barron also acknowledged Eric Schubert's work. He called it top-notch. He said Eric had been instrumental in providing the answers the Chiverella family had been waiting for. Eric Schubert, now 20 years old, stood alongside the law enforcement officials and spoke to the room. He said the investigation had been the hardest thing he'd ever done in his entire life. He said it meant so much to him that he was able to be on the team that provided answers to the Chiverella family. At a certain point, he said, he knew they were going to find the person responsible. Then the Chiverella siblings spoke. Ron Chiverella, now in his 70s, stood at the podium with his surviving siblings, David, Barry, and Carmen Marie. His voice was steady, but emotion flickered beneath the surface. He thanked the Pennsylvania State Police for their persistence. He said that over the past 58 years, investigators had kept in touch with the family every month of every year. He said he felt a sense of closure, though not full closure. That would never come. But now they knew who had taken Marise's life, and they knew he wasn't out there hurting other young girls. Carmen Marie Ratka, Marise's sister, spoke about her memories. She said they had so many precious memories of Marise. She remembered her little sister sitting at the organ making up songs. She remembered Marise's bright blue eyes and her gentle nature, but at the same time, their family would always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. They would continue to ask themselves what would have been, what could have been. She said their parents, Carmen and Mary, had both passed away without knowing who killed their daughter. Carmen had died years earlier. Mary had passed away in 2015, but Carmen Marie said they had never wanted revenge or punishment. They wanted justice. Carmen Marie looked into the cameras and said, "Our family now knows the identity of her murderer. Justice has been served today." Lieutenant Brutowski shared a powerful statement. He said that for the first 40-plus years, the Pennsylvania State Police worked the case with old-fashioned police work, knocking on doors, asking questions, chasing leads by word of mouth. Then, DNA evidence changed everything. The Pennsylvania State Police was founded in 1905, Brutowski said. Over half of their existence, they had been investigating this case. Corporal Barron added one more thought. He said he believed the case brought a message to families of victims across the state and across the country, a sense of hope. No matter how long it takes, he said, law enforcement will never give up. The press conference lasted about an hour. News outlets across Pennsylvania, and eventually across the country, picked up the story. It became a symbol of hope, proof that even after decades, even after the suspect is dead, justice can still be found. It was the fourth-oldest cold case in the United States to be solved using forensic genetic genealogy, and it was the oldest in the state of Pennsylvania. Corporal Barron would later say, "We're always told not to get attached to a case, but you can't help it." In the days and weeks following the announcement, the people of Hazleton began to process what they had just learned. For many, it was bittersweet. The mystery had been solved. The killer had a name. But there would be no trial, no prosecution, no courtroom reckoning. James Paul Fort had died in 1980, 42 years before he was identified. He would never answer for what he did. He would never sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence against him. He would never hear the Chiverella family speak about the pain he caused. But, in a way, that didn't matter. Ron Marchetti, a member of the Greater Hazleton Historical Society, who had lived in the city his entire life, told reporters he was just glad it was solved. After all these years, he said, people finally had an answer. The Chiverella family returned to their lives, carrying with them a truth they had waited nearly 6 decades to learn. They placed flowers on Marise's grave at St. Joseph Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery. They spoke her name. They remembered her not as a victim, but as a little girl born on Thanksgiving Day. A girl with bright blue eyes who loved playing the organ, who wanted to become a nun, who grabbed her gloves on a cold March morning and carried 2 cans of fruit to school because she wanted to give a gift to a nun celebrating her feast day. Eric Schubert returned to Elizabethtown College and continued his studies. He also continued his work in forensic genetic genealogy, hoping to help other families find answers in other cold cases. He told reporters that he would always remember Marise. The Pennsylvania State Police closed the case. 57 years, 11 months, and 26 days after it began, the murder of Marise Ann Chiverella was officially solved. On a quiet street in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, there is a small cemetery where the headstones are weathered and the grass grows soft in the spring. One of those headstones belongs to a 9-year-old girl who never got the chance to grow up. Her name is Marise Ann Chiverella. She was born on Thanksgiving Day, 1954. She died on March 18, 1964. In the years between, she played the organ with her brother Ron. She attended Mass with her family. She dreamed of becoming a nun. She helped her father at the little market. For 58 years, the story of what happened to her remained unfinished, a question without an answer, a wound that never healed. But in 2022, that story found its ending, not in a courtroom, not with handcuffs or a sentence, but with a name, a confirmation, a truth that had been hidden for more than half a century. James Paul Fort took Marise's life on March 18, 1964. He died 16 years later, never facing justice. But he did not escape it, because justice is not only found in courtrooms. Sometimes it is found in the quiet persistence of investigators who refuse to give up, in the meticulous work of a college student who dedicates years of his life to a case he never witnessed, in a family that prays for answers every single day, even when hope seems impossible. And sometimes justice is simply knowing the truth. A mother bent over her daughter's casket in 1964 and whispered a farewell kiss. The newspaper called it "Farewell Kiss from Mother" as coffin closed. That mother prayed every night for 51 years that someone would find the person who took her daughter. She died without knowing his name, but her prayer was answered. Marise Ann Chiverella's story is now complete. Her family knows who took her from them. The community of Hazleton knows what happened on that cold March morning. And somewhere in the vast archive of unsolved cases, her name has been moved from open to closed. She is remembered, she is mourned, and she is finally at rest. Thanks for watching. If this story got to you, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next cold case stories. See you soon.